Welcome! In this series of videos, we will look at software add-ons for the PowerBasic Windows compiler. Today we will look again at using the My Little Grid custom grid and SQL tools with SQL Server to speed up your application development. This was our application at the end of the last video. We have a PowerBasic Windows application using My Little Grid, which is a custom grid, to display information coming from a SQL Server database. Now, since the last video, I've added some more data to our table. So we now have 42 records in the table. What we're going to do in today's video is we're going to report on the number of rows returned by our stored procedure on screen, which is the number of rows in the grid. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to add an extra tab to the grid to report on all the department names. This is anticipation of our users wishing to amend the name of existing departments, add new departments, or retire old departments. So giving the users an extra tab on the grid will allow them to see what departments currently exist and a mechanism by which they can amend them. So the first thing we're going to do is to add a small label above the grid to allow us to report on the number of rows returned by our query. So as we will see in the function which displays the grid on screen, the grid is displayed as a dialog in dialog units. And in dialog units, this is where we're actually placing the grid on the screen. 10 from the left and 125 down from the top of the form. So we want to place our label control slightly above the grid, so I think we'll place it at around 100 down. So if we nip into our forms designer, and we will place a label control on the screen, and we will give it a name. We will change the color to blue, and we will position it on screen in dialog units, 10 from the left and 100 down from the top. So if we save that, we return to our code, and if we run that now, we will see there's a nice little label above our grid saying records returned. All we need to do is amend the value of this label when we get the result back from the grid. So we can see from our grid, since we're using the ID column as a unique identifier, that there are 42 records. Now we need a nice easy way of returning the number of rows in every single grid. If we have a look at our My Little Grid Utilities library, I've started to build an index to the library as we start to use these functions. Now we have a pre-built function called getRowsInGrid. If we have a quick look at that one, this is using a sendMessage command to send to the grid to return the row and column total count. This returns a number of rows and a number of columns. So this particular function is returning the number of rows. Having this common function means you can call it quite easily without having to have this code scattered all the way through your application. So all we need to do is to call this function with the grid handle. So since our grid is populated in the initialization of the dialog, just after here is where we need to put our code. So a simple control set text to set the value, and we'll need to put in the handle to the control and the value we want to populate it with. Now this is our new function, getRowsInGrid, and we know the grid handle in this case is grid1. So we'll put that in as a single parameter, and as this returns along and we want to put a string in here, we will convert it to a string. Now all we need is the handle for our new label. So if we have a look at the form, we can see the label we've added is this label records returned. So we'll copy that and we'll place that in here, and there's our code ready to roll. So if we try running that code now, we will see it quite correctly says records returned 42. So this is a nice generic piece of code we can use every time we display information in a grid, whether it's 42 records we're returning or 42,000. So having done that, we have an executable which we can actually run, and this displays our information. So that's the first part completed. The second part we want to do is we wish to create a new tab on this grid to display the department details. Now at the moment we have 42 records in the database scattered through a number of different departments. So the first thing we'll want to do is to go to the database and create a stored procedure whose task in life is to work out the distinct list of departments. So we'll do that first. So we're now logged on to another machine which has SQL Server's Management Studio running. Now the table that contains all the data we want is this table user list. If we just select all the data that's in the table, we'll see all the data coming back quite happily. Now the only information we're actually interested in this case is the department. So if we remove everything except the department, and run this code now, we'll see we're getting a list of 42 records of the departments. An easy way to get the unique list is to put the word distinct before it, and not only does it give you a distinct list of departments, it even sorts them into alphabetical order for you. So we can see quite happily there are a mere 5 departments in this company. So this is the code we wish to execute. So just to keep this tidy, we'll put this into a stored procedure. And there is our SQL going in. This particular stored procedure will not require any parameters. So we can remove the parameter section, and we will now name our stored procedure. DBO for the owner of the stored procedure, and we'll call this one Get Departments. We'll call it Get Departments List. And if we execute that, and this is the stored procedure we want to use. So we'll need to execute this from inside our code. So how are we going to display this information on the screen? Well, at the moment, our definition of the grid has only a single tab. What we will want to do is to create a brand new tab on that grid. And we can do that from outside the application by using our definition config. If we run that now, and we will pick our MLG demo, and at the moment there is only one tab on the list, and this is a tab which displays the user list. So how do we add a new one? Well, if we go to the add section, it's the same application, it's the same form, it's the same grid, but we're going to call the tab on this one Departments. Now you'll see from the grid we've already done, it's in tab number 1, the first tab on the grid. So if we apply this, come back out, we will exit our application and go back in again to allow us to have a second tab on the list. We have data for the original list, and we have departments. Now at the moment everything is unused. Now if we create the columns we want to display on the screen, and we will unhide this one, and we will mark all these as being in tab 2. Now we're not going to use 50 columns in this particular tab, but it's set up for 50 anyway. So we'll make this slightly wider, and at the moment we'll leave it as locked and we'll leave it as centered. So if we save this now, and we can exit our configuration utility, and if we go back to our code, we can run the exe without any changes, and we will now have a second tab on the screen, Data and Departments. When the application runs, it will leave the grid in the last department you created. So if you wish the Data tab to be initially shown, we'll need to change that in the code. But there are our two tabs added without changing the executable at all. All we have to do now is to populate the Department tab. And to do that, we'll do that in exactly the same way as we did the population of the first tab. We'll go back to our event handler, and we'll see in here we'd specified the name, the first grid, and the tab name. All we need to do now then is another generic populate aimed at the other tab. Same form name, same grid name, but the tab name is going to be changing. The tab name is Departments. And we'll also have to change the SQL to call the other store procedure. So our SQL was get departments list. So if we try running that code now, we will see that the Departments tab is now populated with the 5 departments. And our user data is still showing quite happily on the first tab. So if we wish the application to default to showing the first tab, we need to switch it back to that. So how do we do that in the code? So how we achieve this is after population of the first tab on the grid, we use a send message command to select the first tab so that the call to get rows in the grid is returning the number of rows in that tab of the grid specifically. Then we can call the SQL to populate the second tab of the grid. And at the end, we switch back to the first tab so it's displayed on screen. So when that runs, it correctly reports there are 42 records on the first tab. When we switch to the second tab, it would be nice if this text could be changed to report the number of records on this tab, and when you switch back to the first, it would switch back to that. Now to achieve this, we'll need to put some code in our application to handle the switching between tabs as an event. But we will cover that in the next video. That's it for today. Thank you for watching.